Welcome back to episode 4 of Women's Digital Health. And in this episode, we'll be talking about the state of women's health. Why do women feel as if it's so expensive to pay for their health? We'll be talking about healthcare costs. We'll be talking about insurance premiums. We'll address the gender wage gap and how that impacts the ability for a woman to actually pay for her health. And we'll definitely dive into that pink tax. You're going to like this episode. I think this episode is really going to give you more insight as to where your money is going and why you're feeling like, hey, healthcare is expensive for me, and it is definitely impacting women more so than we think. Good news number 1 is that we are seeing a significant increase in the number of women that first are enrolling in college. But more importantly, women are actually also enrolling in graduating. They are completing degrees. And so this is promising because it means that as more women become educated, and if they choose to enter the workforce, as companies look for top talent, more of them are going to be women. And that top talent does want to know more about how their healthcare insurance is being paid and what their compensation wage would be compared to their male counterparts. They are going to be entering into legislation. They'll be making changes and decisions that impact states' ability to fund healthcare. There is a new path forward, and it's already happening as women continue to take action in terms of getting education and getting into jobs where they're able to actually make the money to afford to impact other women that come behind them. Ladies, I know you are fired up about that pink tax, learning more about how your health care insurance premiums can be impacted in these very different, subtle ninja ways that if you weren't following some of these rulings, you didn't realize. But there's good news. I want to make sure that you have a right to have emotions around how gender disparities do show up. But I also want you to keep in mind that there are a lot of great things coming down the pipeline that are already happening, and we'll talk about that. Make sure you subscribe to our newsletter, follow us on all our social media platforms, and thank you so much for your time.